Alright, welcome back to part 2 of the Second World War episode. When I left off the last time, I was left at September the 1st, 1939, which is the date that Nazi Germany invaded Poland and started the Second World War. Now, at the onset of the war, many countries were quick to declare their neutrality, like the Netherlands, Belgium, and the US. Their neutrality would ultimately not last, but they'll join later. For now, Germany is invading Poland and doing it with striking efficiency. Their military doctrine of Blitzkrieg, or lightning war in English, will ultimately be the Germans' tactic that brings Europe to its knees in just 2 short years. The doctrine itself relies on panzer divisions, or tanks, to rush forward and encircle retreating infantry divisions, all the while those enemy divisions are being harassed by close air support, planes designed to dive low and bomb key positions, as opposed to the strategic bombing campaigns that the Allies will undertake later on in the war. This strategy worked extremely well in Poland, and the Germans were able to blitz their way to Warsaw, and Poland surrendered on September 27, 1939. Also, the Soviet Union invaded Poland on the 17th of September, and the partition between Nazi Germany and the USSR was set up on the Bug River behind Warsaw. So that's kind of on the eastern side of Warsaw, behind. Moving towards the western and central parts of Europe, Hitler waited for 6 months before launching any offensives, in a period dubbed as the Phony War. The French also really didn't launch any attacks on the Germans' lines facing the Maginot, believing that straying behind their fort line would be for the best. The peace ended when Germany invaded Denmark on April 9, 1940, and within hours the country fell to German occupation. While this was happening, Germany launched a combined naval/paratroop invasion into Norway and had taken numerous strategic centers in a few days. In a few weeks, the Germans had occupied the entirety of Norway, and they turned their attention southwards and towards the Low Countries. Also, the Germans invaded Norway and Denmark because they wanted to protect their iron ore shipments from neutral Sweden, which the Allies wanted to disrupt. So Germany invaded Scandinavia to protect their shipments, while the Allies tried to defend Scandinavia from German occupation. Alright, moving on to the Low Countries, which I said I'll move on to. In essentially 4 days, from May 10th to 14th, the Germans used those same blitzkrieg tactics that had swarmed Poland with to overrun the Dutch. Belgium took some more time to be subdued thanks to increased Allied presence in the country, but Belgium fell too. On to France and the botched defense of their country. Following the fall of Belgium, lead elements of a panzer group had crossed the Meuse River, which runs through Belgium and France. Bombing from the German close air support, or the Stukas, which were the name of the actual plane, had demoralized the French troops there, and since the French thought the Ardennes forest was impenetrable, they left it relatively lightly guarded. A few days later, the Panzer Corps, led by Heinz Guderian, a German general, broke through the French line through the Ardennes, and they had steamed ahead, driving deep into French territory and leaving his flanks unguarded. If he were to get encircled by Allied troops, it would put an end to his advance, but that didn't happen, and he commanded his men forward. He swung towards the Channel and essentially severed communication between the Allies. Guderian wasn't the outlier, though, in terms of success. Rommel's and Reinhardt's divisions also broke through Allied defenses on the Meuse and penetrated deep into French territory. If you remember from the World War I episode, this German attack closely resembled the Schlieffen Plan, the German tactic to bypass French defenses on the border. This time, the sledgehammer of the German attack hit pay dirt. The Allied defenses were shattered. What's interesting about the Battle of France was the overall doctrines and technology used by both sides. It is a common thought that the Germans possessed the most advanced tanks at the start of the war, but the French R-35 light tank was actually better armored and outgunned the Panzer Is and IIs that made up the bulk of the German spearhead. The French problem lied more with the deployment of the tanks. Many of the French generals and high commands were stuck with the World War I mindset and the doctrine of static warfare and a grand battle plan. As such, the tank's purpose was to support the infantry and hold the line, as opposed to taking advantage of the speed and armor that tanks possess, and to use that speed and armor to punch holes into infantry lines, something that the Germans exploited with their blitzkrieg. French tanks also lacked radios and instead had to rely on hand signals and flags, unlike their German counterparts, and those hand signals and flags severely hampered the Allies' ability to coordinate and organize forces. Going back to the breakthrough and Channel and the progression of the battle, the Germans had managed to wrap northward from their breakthrough and get to the Channel. At that point, the French Prime Minister, Paul Reynaud, sacked the French High General Gamelin and replaced him with Maxime Weygand. Weygand took some time to issue orders to the now trapped French and British armies in the north of France, and this allowed Germany to reinforce their flanks and prevent any breakthrough from completely cutting off their spearhead. The French and British attempted to break out of this pocket, but their efforts were unsuccessful due to poor communication and coordination, which is something of a theme in the Battle of France. After a few days, the British launched Operation Dynamo, the plan to evacuate Allied troops so they could fight another day. The French troops fought bravely to allow their Allied comrades to evacuate, holding out the city of Lille to draw the German attention away from Dunkirk, which is where the British eventually managed to escape from. All told, the British managed to keep 200,000 troops, and they were joined by 140,000 Frenchmen. The Allies lost many guns, artillery pieces, tanks, and other machines, however, but the men made it out alive. It's an old adage that it takes an hour to produce a gun, but 18 years to replace a soldier, and I definitely didn't just make that up. With the evacuation completed, the Germans could focus their entire attention on the French in the center and south of the country, and their strength on dominating the remainder of the French army. From this point, it took a little less than 2 months for France to be overrun, and the Battle of France was concluded on June 25th, 1940. The Battle of Britain started shortly after, and it served as a turning point of sorts for the Allies, and a major victory for them. What it was a large-scale air battle for control over the skies over the English Channel, and later Britain itself. The German Luftwaffe had the reputation of being the strongest air force at that time, and Hitler hoped that its reputation as a fierce fighting force would intimidate the British into submitting. But the British people, led by Winston Churchill, rejected submission. Churchill made his famous "We shall fight on the beaches" speech, which called for unwavering resistance against the Germans. So the battle moved forward. German Messerschmitt's Bf-109s faced off against British Hawker Hurricanes and Supermarine Spitfires. At the start of the battle, German forces outnumbered British forces, but not to the point where it was an insurmountable advantage. The German strategy was to knock the Royal Air Force, or RAF, out of the war through means of bombing factories and airfields, or through air engagements. The RAF's goal was to obviously defend the British homeland through whatever means necessary, and they were helped by two of their main aircraft being adept at two different roles: the Hurricane at bomber interception, and the Spitfire at dogfights, which is fighter-on-fighter conflict. In addition to this, the British had the best radar system in the world, the Chain Home system, which was used to alert the regional headquarters and get them to mobilize quickly. The Germans didn't have good bombers, or bombers capable of delivering knockout payloads. The Junkers Ju-88 and the Heinkel He-111 were lightly armed and vulnerable to British fighters. The Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers that had devastated Poland, the Low Countries, and France were of no use in the bombing campaign and equally vulnerable. Combine this with the fact that the Bf-109s had limited range into Britain and had set up a bloodbath for the Luftwaffe aircraft. In just about a month of fighting, the Luftwaffe had lost 600 aircraft to the RAF's 260. But despite of the favorable ratios, the RAF was still losing fighters at pilot at an unsustainable rate. The fighter group stationed around London was on its last legs. Germany didn't really have any plan for action, however. But on one night, a British bomber had bombed Berlin in retaliation for the strikes from the Germans, and that enraged Hitler so much that he turned his focus onto bombing civilian targets instead of military targets like he had been doing before. From here on out, the Germans switched to night raids over Britain as another strategy to cripple the production and morale of the British. While these raids, known as the Blitz, did make life tough for the British civilians, it did little to dampen the British morale and wrest control of the skies for the Germans. Hitler then called off the invasion to focus on the Soviets, and the battle against Britain developed into U-boat raids and the blockade. The Battle of Britain officially ended on October 31st, 1940, and with Hitler unable to knock out the British, he set his sights east to the Soviet Union. But that begs the question, what had been going on in the Soviet Union prior to the German invasion in 1941? A bit of foreshadowing. I'll start with the leader of the Soviet Union and progress from there. Joseph Stalin was born into a poor family in Georgia in 1878, with the present-day country of Georgia being under the rule of the Russian Empire then. Stalin first joined the Marxist Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, and he rose up the ranks there, going on to edit the party's newspaper, Pravda. Stalin then helped to fund Lenin's projects through robberies and murder. During this time, Stalin was exiled a few times to Siberia for plotting against the state, and while he escaped a few times, he remained there until he was drafted into the Russian army, but he was deemed unfit for service. As you might remember from the last episode, the Russian Revolution took place during World War I. The communists managed to seize power during the revolution, but not without civil war breaking out. It was because of a series of blunders by Stalin that Trotsky and Lenin started to doubt Stalin and blame him for military failures. Despite this, Lenin nominated Stalin for the position of General Secretary in the party, which placed Stalin in a position of power. Now, Stalin could start nominating his allies to a position of power in the Communist Party and guarantee his support if there was a split in the party lines. When Lenin died in 1924, Stalin was in a prime position to consolidate power at the top following the vacuum left by Lenin. Stalin aimed to transfer the USSR's economy from an agrarian society to that of an industrial powerhouse through a series of 5-year plans, the first starting in 1928. Stalin focused on government control of the economy and the forced collectivization of Soviet agriculture. Millions of farmers opposed this, and they were shot or exiled for their defiance, which would become standard for Stalin's rule. The collectivization process and the removal of millions of farmers contributed to a widespread famine across the USSR, which killed millions, with one of those being the Holodomor, a famine in Ukraine that killed close to 4 million Ukrainians. Stalin ruled with an iron fist in order to continue eliminating those that posed a threat to him. He expanded the NKVD, the secret police, and encouraged citizens to spy on each other to root out opposition to his rule by killing them or exiling dissidents to the gulags, or forced labor camps. The killings came to a head in 1936 when Stalin instituted a Great Purge, intended to rid the CCCP of opponents to Stalin, or the Central Communist Party. This decimated the military leadership, and this will become important soon. Stalin also attempted to build a cult of personality around himself by rewriting the history books, mythologizing parts of his life, and becoming the subject of literature and the arts, and by renaming Volgograd to Stalingrad. We come now to 1939, where Hitler and Stalin signed a non-aggression pact and territorial pact, which gave the USSR control of eastern Poland, the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and the eastern part of Romania, which now makes up present-day Moldova. This pact, also known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, with Vyacheslav Molotov being the Soviet foreign minister and Joachim von Ribbentrop being the German equivalent, made Stalin ignorant to a German attack. Stalin foolishly believed that Germany would honor the pact, despite Hitler repeatedly expressing his desire to expand his territory eastward and attain Lebensraum, or living space for the Aryan people at expense for the Slavic people, along with Hitler's general policy of anti-Bolshevism. Hitler was further emboldened by the Soviet performance in the Winter War, which was lacking, to say the least. The invading Soviets were given a harsh thrashing by the defending Finns. The Soviets eventually overcame the Finns and forced a peace upon them which ceded Karelia to the USSR, but it came at a heavy cost. So despite Allied warnings, on June 22, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the code name for the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. Hitler originally wanted the operation to commence in mid-May, but an invasion of Yugoslavia and Greece delayed the invasion. Still, the German high command was confident that Germany would roll over the USSR in a few months, avoiding the Russian winter. Germany committed 150 divisions in the form of 3 million men, 3,000 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and 2,500 aircraft for the invasion, making it the largest invasion ever assembled in the history of mankind. To counter this, German intelligence had correctly estimated that the Soviets had 150 divisions in the western parts of the USSR, but are not accounted for the other Soviet divisions that were scattered throughout the USSR, so like in the center of the country, in the far east, and everywhere else. And those divisions made up 200. So in total, the USSR had 350 divisions against Germany's 150. The Soviets also had superior amounts of tanks and airplanes, but the Soviet tanks were about equal to the Germans. Their air force was obsolete at that time. Hitler famously said, "We only have to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down," in reference to the Soviet Union. With this, Operation Barbarossa commences, opening the largest and bloodiest theater of the war in history. In the north, General von Lieb's Army Group North struck from East Prussia into the Baltics towards Leningrad and St. Petersburg. In the south, General von Rundstedt's Army Group South advanced south from southern Poland into Ukraine against Kiev. In the center, General von Bock's Army Group Center started north of the Pripyat marshes and aimed to wheel north and reach the cities of Smolensk and Moscow. Finnish forces also attacked in the far north in an attempt to reclaim the territory they had lost to the Soviets during the Winter War. Along with Stalin, the invasion caught Soviet military leadership completely unaware, and as a result, Soviet forces were unprepared and demobilized. Much like in France, the German advance started off extremely strong, with tank groups gaining 50 miles on the first day and taking 200 miles of territory to reach Minsk in present-day Belarus. Soviet troops were cut off around Minsk, but some were able to escape the pockets. Also, while the Soviets had superior amounts of tanks, they were badly coordinated due to a lack of radios, and the commanders wasted them by attacking German positions in a piecemeal fashion. But the German advance was beginning to slow. Rainstorms in May and July turned roads to mud, which made transportation of supplies and movement of tanks slow to a crawl. In addition to this, the Soviets also used scorched earth tactics, which was basically destroying farms and other resources that can be used by invading forces, but it also means that you also don't get to use them. So it's a tactic to delay invasions, but it also makes the people living in those invaded territories much worse off. The Soviets also managed to dismantle and send factories eastward, over rails, so that the war production could still continue to remain effective. But despite all this, the Germans had managed to advance 400 miles in around a month, and the line was only 200 miles from Moscow. Kiev was taken by the end of July, and the pincer movement executed by Kleist and Guderian netted 520,000 men in a pocket. Incompetent Soviet leadership and stubbornness by Stalin contributed to these encirclements, as Stalin wanted Soviet troops to stand and fight rather than retreating to regroup. We move forward to October of 1941, where von Bock has managed to close an encirclement around the city of Vyazma, west of Moscow, which brought another 600,000 soldiers under German control. But by the time the battle was concluded, German troops were wary and their path forward became blocked by new Soviet troops. But von Bock remained inside of Moscow, and against the other commander's wishes, he pushed on, thinking that the Russians were low on strength. Indeed, the Germans estimated that the Red Army should have been annihilated, as they had suffered millions of casualties and enormous equipment losses in the months of fighting. German commanders expected all Soviet resistance to evaporate by then, yet they continued to resist fiercely. The offensive was halted at the outskirts of Moscow, partly because the dreaded Russian winter had arrived, and this was a uniquely terrible winter for everyone. The winter produced some of the coldest temperatures on record, and as I write this, it's hovering around 60 in late December. Frostbite had already begun to affect the troops as they didn't have any winter clothing. Tanks froze, artillery was rendered useless, and trucks were unable to move. And as a comparison, the Russians were better equipped to fight in the winter as they had the training and equipment to do so. As the German offensive ground to a halt, the Soviets under General Zhukov launched their first major counteroffensive, aimed at dislodging von Bock from his position around Moscow and getting back to Smolensk. Troops from Siberia proved to be excellent fighters in the cold, and they were the difference in the offensive. While the Germans had managed to drive deep into the Soviet Union and inflict major losses on the Soviets, the conditions for Barbarossa were not met, and the USSR was still fighting. Furthermore, German losses were heavy as well. The Soviet winter offensive achieved its goal of pushing the Germans back, and the offensive stalled out by April of 1942. Barbarossa had failed to knock the Soviet Union out as intended, and now the Germans were stuck in a war of attrition. Germany no longer had the strength to launch an offensive across the entire front, so they could only make attacks in certain sectors of the front line. Before we move on to the next phase of offensives and battles, it's important to talk about Europe under German occupations. The Germans successfully invaded many countries during the period of 1939 to 41, and they now had the task of occupying and administering large chunks of continental Europe. Nazi conduct varied from abusive to genocidal depending on the area. In Western Europe, the Nazis were more lenient but still oppressive. Curfews were still in force, food was rationed, and the Jewish population were rounded up in ghettos and cities. Wealth was plundered and sent back to Germany to ensure the German civilian population could continue living well in wartime. People were also forced to work in German arms industries and suffered from poor wages, terrible conditions, and abuse. In Eastern Europe, the Nazis were waging a war on annihilation, a type of war in which the goal is complete annihilation of a state, a people, or an ethnic minority through genocide or through the destruction of their livelihood. As I mentioned before, the Nazis viewed Slavic people such as Poles, Ukrainians, and Russians as subhuman. This is thoroughly reflected in their occupation policy. The Nazi ideologues saw the future of the East and one of settlement of German colonists, so the natives were killed, expelled, or reduced to slave labor. The cruel and brutally inhumane treatment of civilians, women, children, and the elderly, the daily bombing of civilian cities and towns, Nazi pillaging of villages and hamlets, and unprecedented harsh punishments and treatment of civilians in general were some of the primary reasons for resistance to Nazi Germany. This, of course, bred a great deal of resistance in the territories, as I just explained. The Nazis dealt with resistance by enacting brutal collective justices. Entire communities were suspected of supporting partisans were completely incinerated and massacred. If a partisan were to kill a German soldier, the Germans would respond by killing 8, 10, or even more civilians. Mobile death squads called the Einsatzgruppen performed extrajudicial killings against Jewish populations, intelligentsia, and leaders in occupied territory. Many more civilians died from mass starvation as the Germans seized food to feed their armies and the population. Trapped civilians were caught in the middle of fierce fighting that took place in towns and cities. Captured soldiers did not fare any better than civilians, though. Millions of Soviet soldiers were in German captivity after the massive defeats of Operation Barbarossa, well, in the beginning anyway. A general lack of disregard of the well-being of POWs, along with a shortage of food, led to well over a 50% mortality rate for Soviet POWs. With that, we end a solemn note and head back to the battles. Spring had become summer, and now it was the Germans' turn to launch an attack, and in late July, Army Group South started out towards the Caucasus Mountains in an attempt to secure the oil fields there. The 6th German Army had started for Stalingrad, which resembled a key point to secure on the way south for the Caucasus, and a symbolic city to take given its name. While the 1st Panzer Army had managed to get to the foothills of the Caucasus, their advance was stopped, and the German offensive into Russia was fully done. Back to Stalingrad, which will prove to be a defining point and a turning point for the war in the east. The 6th and 4th Panzer Armies had fought their way into Stalingrad through street-by-street fighting and experienced brutal hand-to-hand combat. But unknown to them was the Soviet troops making their way behind the city, and those troops punched through the flanks of the Germans in Stalingrad, trapping the 2 armies in the city. The Germans tried desperately to relieve the 6th Army, but the relief effort fell short of the city. The Soviets pushed out from the city, destroying aircraft that had been supplying the troops inside Stalingrad and dooming them further. The battle ended on 31st Jan 1943 with the surrender of the 90,000 remaining members of the 6th Army, down from 300,000. With this, the Soviets pushed forward towards Kursk and Kharkiv, retaking cities in the east and leaving a salient around Kursk, following a breakthrough by German panzer divisions. In the summer of 1943, Hitler wanted to execute one last offensive in the hopes of regaining the land that was lost in 1942. The plan was to attack from the north and from the south of the city of Kursk in order to restore the lines of Army Group South. The push in the north was stopped relatively quickly, with the spearhead only advancing 5 miles. The southern thrusts had been more successful, but they too were stopped, with one of the largest tank battles occurring between the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, the Grof Deutsches Land Panzer Grenadier Division, and the Soviet 5th Guards Tanks Division. The battle proved to be a Pyrrhic victory for the Soviets, as they were successful in stopping the German advance, but had lost over 600 tanks. By autumn of 1943, the Soviets had started to push the Germans back west, starting with the retaking of Kharkiv in August. Army Group South had been pushed back behind the Dnieper River by September, and the line there was hard to defend. From there, Kiev was retaken in early November. The Soviets managed to advance 500 miles by March, which culminated in a major encirclement of German panzers. The center and north were comparably quiet, but Soviet troops had been advancing there, and German forces were pushed back from Leningrad and Novgorod into Estonia by February of 1944. Before I continue with 1944, I'll take a moment to mention the siege of Leningrad and the strategic bombing campaign being launched by the Allies, starting with the former. During the initial assault by the Germans, Leningrad was surrounded and cut off from the rest of the country, while the German army severed the last road leading into the city. The German plan for the city was to encircle it and let it starve, and then to come in and occupy it when the population was lower. Many people died from starvation, disease, and cold, with deaths totaling over 1.5 million civilians and soldiers. A road was able to be made over a frozen lake in 1943, but it was unable to supply enough food to the citizens living in the cities to survive. The siege was finally lifted in January of 1944, marking the end of 872 days of siege in Leningrad. It has been described as one of the deadliest and destructive sieges in human history, and perhaps the most costliest to human life in the history of mankind. Moving on, following the introduction of the USA into the conflicts, brought bomber campaigns to more of a forefront. Bombing raids were conducted at a relatively minor scale prior to 1942, but now the Americans were able to supply and use long-range bombers with larger payloads and the ability to defend themselves. The B-17 Flying Fortress is a great example of these strategic bombers. Armed with 10 to 13 50-caliber machine guns, a range of close to 4,000 miles, and a payload of close to 10,000 pounds in ordnance, this airplane could pack a punch, and that it did. In combination with the RAF, the Americans and British adopted the strategy of round-the-clock bombing, with the Americans going by day and the British by night. Bombing by day was riskier because the enemy planes were able to spot the bombers more easily, but day bombing also had the benefit of greater accuracy for bombers, which in turn, night bombing was less accurate but also less lethal to RAF people. All in all, it combined to create a devastating blow to Axis industries. Throw in the P-51 Mustang, a fighter plane that had the range to escort bombers fully, the agility to engage in dogfights with Axis fighters, and the Allies ruled the skies from 1943 onwards. Moving back to the progression of the war, we arrive at June 6, 1944, D-Day. the largest and most consequential naval landing undertaken by any power. It involved the Americans, British, and Canadian forces, and under the cover of darkness, they landed at 5 beaches, the Americans at Utah and Omaha, the British at Gold and Juneau, and the Canadians at Sword. Fighting was fierce, and the Germans had made fortifications as part of their Atlantic Wall, and the efforts to control these fortifications were costly, particularly on Omaha Beach, where the casualties were the highest. The Allies were unable to take any ports within the initial assault, but they were able to be supplied by floating harbors known by Mulberry ports. All 3 countries were able to fight inland and gain a foothold in France, but the important port city of Cherbourg was not taken. The German strategy of engaging British forces had allowed the Americans to break towards Cherbourg, and by June 28th, the city was captured, allowing for the flow of supplies and materiel into France. The Allies had also started battles of attrition, knowing that the Germans were running short on equipment and men. The Germans had to make a choice between engaging the British and Americans, and the Germans chose the former. This allowed the Americans to launch Operation Cobra, intended to reach the Brittany Peninsula and cut off Normandy from the rear. This success succeeded, and the German armies trapped there only narrowly escaped, but without their equipment. The Allies had managed to cross the Seine by the end of August, and the liberation of Paris occurred on August 26th. At around this time, the Soviets had managed to push their way into Slovakia and were making progress in the Baltic states. Continuing on the Eastern Front and into 1945, the Soviets had managed to liberate Warsaw on 17th January 1945. By now, the Soviets had a healthy advantage in just about everything: men, armor, field guns, and aircraft. The Soviets also pushed into East Prussia during this time, along with the southern thrust that netted the Soviets Vienna in April. Königsberg, an important city in East Prussia, fell on 9th of April and was renamed Kaliningrad, where it's still part of Russian territory. Moving back to the west, the Allies were now breaking out across France and liberating France. And by September of 1944, parts of the front line had gotten close to the German border. The Allies also launched an invasion of southern France from North Africa to further pressure the Germans, and by this point, Italy was out of the war through a combination of civil war and another Allied invasion known as Operation Avalanche. As the Allies were approaching the Rhine, Germany launched its last major counteroffensive in the Battle of the Bulge. The German plan was to attack through the Ardennes, get to Antwerp in Belgium, and split the British and American lines. While the attack was initially successful, it was repulsed, and by the end of January 1945, the attack was over. Hitler wasted valuable men and equipment that he couldn't replenish and use for the upcoming Allied invasion of Germany. The Germans stubbornly refused to give up land in France, which only lost them men, equipment, and everything else. By the end of February, the Rhine was crossed, and by the end of April, cities such as Bremen and Magdeburg were captured. The Allies and Soviets met at the Elbe River by late April. The decision was taken to not push into eastern Germany by the Allies. Speaking of the Soviets, they had also managed to successfully push the Germans fully out of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, and were going full speed ahead to Germany. Stalin's goal was to take as much land as possible to set up a Soviet sphere of influence that was as large as possible. The Soviets had pushed into Berlin on the 29th of April, and it was now that Hitler committed suicide and ended the Third Reich. After about a week's more fighting, Germany surrendered on the 7th of May, 1945 at Rheims in France, and the surrender was relayed to the Soviets the following day. All told, World War II took the lives of 15 million men, injured 25 million men, and caused the deaths of 45 million civilians. The USSR lost over 20 million people, Germany close to 9 million. Comfortably, the US and UK suffered significantly fewer military and civilian deaths. You might now ask yourself, what was the post-war world like, seeing that the USSR and the USA/UK were ideologically opposites? The big three of Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin met at 3 different conferences to decide the world after the war. The first at Tehran, the 3 leaders discussed strategies to defeat the Axis, with Stalin pledging his support to Roosevelt, in return for Stalin getting a buffer region in the Baltics, Poland, and a part of Germany. While Churchill was deeply suspicious of Stalin, Roosevelt was able to win him over and keep the 2 leaders from going after each other. The second conference in Yalta, in Crimea, the 3 powers agreed to divide Europe into different political spheres of influence. The plan was to divide Germany into 4 different zones, each administered by one power and one by France. The zones were occupied by the US, UK, and France would later be brought together to form West Germany, and the Soviet zone would be made into East Germany. The Allies would transition the countries of Italy, Austria, and Greece to democracy, and the Soviets promised to hold free elections in the nation they liberated. Finally, the conferences at Potsdam with Truman instead of Roosevelt vowed to demilitarize and pacify Germany and deal with the influx of German immigrants into Axis nations. When the dust settled, the West was made up of France, the UK, Denmark, Norway, Italy, the Low Countries of Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, Portugal, Greece, West Germany, and Turkey. The East comprised of East Germany, Albania, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and the USSR. Switzerland, Spain, Yugoslavia, Sweden, Austria, and Sweden remained neutral, all for different reasons. Spain was still led by a fascist dictator in Franco. Yugoslavia was led by a communist in Tito. But Tito and Stalin had disagreements, so Yugoslavia stayed out of the Soviet sphere of influence. Switzerland and Sweden have historically been neutral nations, but with a tilt towards the West. And with that, I conclude this part of my history videos. It's been a long ride, and I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to come learn about history from me. Thank you for watching, and I won't see you next time because this is the end. Thank you for watching, and hope you learned something.
That's all, folks.